Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. American businesses played a major role in helping China's reform and opening. To many people who've been involved in business and commerce between US and China, there's a certain pride in helping China's impressive economic development, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. However, they're also most realistic about China's intentions and goals. Today's guest is a veteran business executive, Mark Atkeson, who spent 3 decades doing business between US and China. He recently published the book, Risky Business in Rising China, sharing lessons learned as an entrepreneur during China's growth period and experience working in sectors of intense competition today, such as semiconductors and electronic vehicles. Welcome, Mark.
Wenqi, good morning, and thank you for having me on your show. As you said, I worked in China for basically from the early 1980s up until very recently. And my career in China coincided with essentially a golden age of market-oriented reforms that resulted in lifting 800 million people out of poverty in China. And I like to say to my friends that this event in the world is the most important thing, even more important than, the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I'm happy to have been part of experiencing that amazing transformation in China, and I look forward to sharing with your audience today.
Well, that's an incredible experience. And, obviously, other than sharing all your, journeys and adventures as an expat in China from early days in the 80s all the way to, the 2014, 15, what do you hope the readers can learn from your book?
Yeah, so, I'll comment on 3 areas. One is that, there's often a misperception with business people outside of China that China is a big monolithic, state-owned economy. And China is actually, over the period of the last 30 years, the private sector grew up to be, over 60% of GDP and over 80% of urban employment. And the private sector is a hive of millions of firms that are fast and nimble and adaptable, who are chasing market opportunities and dodging restrictive regulations. And, Chinese entrepreneurs are free agents. They're eager to do deals, and they're also eager to partner with foreigners. So, I think number one, the private sector of China offers a lot of opportunity. I think the second area that I would like people to take away from the book is that engaging with China offers, wide-ranging opportunities. I spent a career there in everything from, aircraft maintenance to automotive parts to mobile technology to venture capital. And, China's a big economy. It supports, global supply chains. It has leading technologies in everything from, solar to AI to electric vehicles to batteries. And so, one can engage with China and find all kinds of interesting business opportunities. And then, the last thing I'll highlight, Wenqi, is that the younger generation, so when I refer to them, the millennials and the Gen Z, have grown up in a China that is, radically more modern than what the older generations experienced. And I think as they inherit the reins of power of the country over, the next decade, they will drive China in a very positive direction.
Well, I think you do sounds like, you have a more optimistic view about China's future, while some may not hold the same view. And what's interesting is when you talk about the 60% of China's economy being private. And I think one counter argument for many in the US is that China has no true private sector. They don't really believe that they're private businesses because, ultimately the Communist Party controls everything. And can you just sort of say, whether you believe it? I know you don't believe it, but, what's the counter argument that private sector is truly owned by private entrepreneurs?
Yeah, no, a very good point. And I think let me highlight two areas. I think that as the private sector grew and scaled up to a point where many of these private companies were at the same scale as companies we recognize here in the U.S. like Amazon and Microsoft. You think of Alibaba and Tencent; they were on their way to trillion-dollar market capitalizations, and unfortunately, in 2021. The central government of China cracked down on the business scope and applied all kinds of restrictive regulations to the private sector. And as a result, it's taken a toll. So, Alibaba and Tencent are down about 2/3 from their peak market cap. And, one of the greater tolls is that youth unemployment has increased significantly because of the loss of, business confidence and business outlook in the private sector. However, if we turn to an industry like electric vehicles in China is almost completely a story about the private sector. You don't see, First Auto Works and Second Auto Works. You don't see the big state-owned enterprises who joint ventured with VW and GM and Toyota.
Well, let's talk about that because there's a lot of concern about Chinese-made EVs flooding global markets, right?
Yes.
And there are people basically, on the U.S. side saying it's unfair trade practice because it's, in some way supported by the government. But it sounds like you argued that they're truly private. There's no state involvement.
I would say this. It's a hybrid, and let me put it this way: that in many industries in China, there tend to be more companies domestically in China than the entire rest of the world combined. And so, if you look at the electric vehicle story, when it became clear that local governments and the central government would provide subsidies for, setting up production of electric vehicles, hundreds of companies piled in. And that's a phenomenon in one industry after another in China, is that if people see an opportunity to make money, a lot of private firms jump in. And, the mandate is to make a quick profit as quickly as you can. So I think the status of where we are with electric vehicles in China today is that they're now down to about a dozen firms that are producing. Many of them are losing money, but many of them are also supported by local governments who champion, their local producer of electric vehicles. And so you're right in the sense that countries outside of China are concerned about the overcapacity because, clearly in the Chinese automotive market today, there's significant overcapacity, not just in EVs, but actually in internal combustion engine vehicles as well. And so, the situation we'll have in China is that there will be winners and losers. If you sell more electric vehicles, the internal combustion engine vehicle makers will lose out on market share. I think that what will happen internationally, and this is actually maybe also me projecting my hope, is that as these private companies look to figure out how to expand their businesses, that they consider putting plants into Europe and the United States. As you may remember, in the 1980s, Toyota and Honda and Nissan all localized production in the U.S., and the U.S. became a major beneficiary of that through, obviously U.S. jobs as well.
Job creation, yeah.
Yeah, and greater competitiveness. So back to your point, what I would say is, I think if we analyze the EV industry in China today, it's still made up almost primarily of privately held companies, with BYD being the leader of the companies.
Yeah. So I think the lesson learned maybe from your experience there is that it's not as black and white in terms of government's role. Some subsidies, clearly. However, it is still largely driven by private entrepreneurs. Obviously, the innovation and also technologies will have to come from the people themselves. And I think that's something people who don't understand China have to keep in mind. We want to talk about, semiconductors, which is also an important part of auto manufacturing. You work for Sony Semiconductors early on, and back then there was a US ban on selling semiconductors to China as well, but chips were still smuggled from Hong Kong to China. I thought that was a really interesting story. And does that tell us something about today's chips control?
Yeah, I think that, when we think back to the end of the 1980s, America had a lot of paranoia about the Japanese and the Japanese control of the memory chip market. And, it was clear that at a certain moment in time, the Japanese had a lot of leverage on, IT equipment producers because they effectively controlled most of the memory chip market. And I remember sitting in Sony with the Japanese managers, and we would speak with, American producers of disk drives and other IT equipment in Singapore. And the Japanese basically said, in order to buy our memory chips, you have to buy our, higher value-added integrated circuits as well. So that was America's greatest fear, was that, by controlling that market, the Japanese would then be able to have this sort of domino effect of taking over better, higher and higher value-added product. And I think that's, sort of the fear of China. However, what happened, after the 1980s period of Japanese control was that, Japan and Korea ended up over-investing in memory chips. And to a certain degree, memory chips became a commodity in the market. And, now if we fast forward to today with China, I'll make 2 points. One is this point about, smuggling chips in. So we, as you said, we discovered while I was at Sony that when we visited Nanjing, we found dealers in China who were reselling Sony chips that had been prohibited for sale in China. And, when we dug a little deeper, the Hong Kong agents we were working with basically admitted that people were filling suitcases and carrying chips into China. So maybe we'll find NVIDIA chips, smuggled into China in the same fashion. So, the point I would make about that is that the world is too big and too diverse to try to control access to the technology. And
yeah, it's interesting. If you look at today, right, both US and Japan are starting to reshoring the manufacturing of semiconductors. And you've, watched over the years sort of US and Japan losing their advantage and now trying to regain their advantage. Is the CHIPS Act going to reverse the trend from your point of view?
It's a good question. So obviously the CHIPS Act is a major exercise in US industrial policy to, localize more semiconductor production. I think we have to be careful because, again, if we look at what happened 30 years ago, we would not have wanted to invest in a lot of memory chip production where memory chips ended up with basically very low returns in the market. And, so we have to be careful here in America that we don't we don't have wasteful investments in, semiconductor sectors. And look, the Americans are just as guilty as everyone else in terms of every state in this country, will rush to grab whatever subsidies are handed out by the federal government, regardless of the economic prospects of the actual chip product. But I think that, what we learned was that America did end up focusing on areas of strength, which tended to be more processors than memory chips. And, look at where we are today. I mean, NVIDIA and you even look at Apple and what Apple has done to design its own chips that go into its own products. Admittedly, there's a security concern about the source of production, that if other
more advanced chips in particular.
Yeah. I mean, is TSMC ever at risk of a situation where there would be a conflict between Taiwan and China? So there is a security concern about the location of the production, but I would say my general feeling is the Taiwanese are very good at making chips. And just by the way, when I can remember back to 40 years ago, almost when I was in college, that there were lots of Taiwanese in my electrical engineering program studying very large integrated circuits.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that certainly that hard work translated into a very successful, building of a major industry in Taiwan. So here's the CHIPS Act is partly directed at a security concern about the location of factories, but we have to be careful that we don't have wasteful investment.
Yeah, I mean, with such high demand, especially these days, AI technology, it looks like we are not right now manufacturing enough chips. That's why so many companies are jumping the bandwagon. However, I do worry if there's going to be an oversupply issue
Yes.
in the future, right? And then, we also want to talk about intellectual property, which has been an issue of friction between US and China just over the last few decades in terms of business and commerce. And you use several examples to say that, quote unquote, respect for intellectual property is not on Chinese mindset. What do you mean by that?
No, it's a good question. So my personal experience started in the 1980s with everyone can remember that desktop computers were primarily using Microsoft operating systems, and most of that software in China was pirated. And so Microsoft was probably losing 90% of its potential revenues, on the usage of its software. And then, at one point in my career in the book, I describe how I worked in the automotive parts industry in the area of diesel fuel injection. And to us, it was perfectly normal to, go out in the world market and buy the latest technology diesel pumps, and then disassemble them in China and figure out how to reverse engineer them and localize them for the Chinese market. So, to us, that was the answer. And then later on, I worked in the internet area, where one could see that many business models were focused on essentially pirating music and video. And then the last example is I worked for an electric vehicle maker over a decade ago called Coda. And as part of our business model, we were actually sourcing the production of our batteries and cars out of China. And so our car partner was Chang'an, which is the fourth largest, state-owned enterprise in vehicle manufacturing in China. And Chang'an basically just openly wanted to extort our drivetrain technology and our battery technology from us, and threatened to shut down vehicle production unless we handed it over for free. And think about the fact that U.S. investors had paid hundreds of millions of dollars to have this technology developed, and Chang'an was like, just give it to us, otherwise we're going to shut you down. So let's put this all in context. That, as I described before, in many areas in China where entrepreneurs can see somebody's making money, everyone piles in. And so there's sort of a herd-like activity, and price wars develop and returns rapidly get driven down. So if you're a Chinese entrepreneur and you're looking to stay alive and stay in business, stealing or copying technology is not seen necessarily as a bad thing, because it's all about speed to market, and it's all about rapidly commercializing technology. So they don't, the legal framework in China is probably not the greatest for protecting intellectual property. But at the same time, I mean, you also have a country where 30 years ago, the central government was encouraging players in the economy to, beg, borrow, steal, do whatever you can to get, international technology, because it was all about, developing a higher standard of living and a more sophisticated economy. So I don't necessarily fault the Chinese. I mean, I think that as Americans, sometimes we do have to remind ourselves that the Chinese are very good at very rapidly commercializing technical innovations. And to them, the imperative is do it quickly.
Yeah, I have to ask though, you say you don't fault the Chinese, right? but it is a major risk for any business who owns the intellectual property. And now, you mentioned Chang'an as an example. Now I have to worry about Tesla, for example, right? The reason why they are still so invested in China, I almost wonder, does Elon Musk have to worry about it right now? Or maybe he's already so entrenched that he can't pull out in some way. But, obviously the world doesn't work that way, right? And so you do have to respect when, one party puts in the research and the resources to develop certain cutting edge technology. And that is also the reason why I think the world is so wary of China these days, because it's no longer just sort of helping to lift people out of poverty. It's literally, are they following the rules, or are they, playing by rules? And if not, why does the world still want China?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and I do respect, I would say, the legal protection of intellectual property. But, the world we live in is one where a young engineer working at Tesla in Shanghai can very easily just switch over and go to BYD and start working.
And probably keep bringing some of the technology.
Probably,
well.
takes very valuable knowledge with them. So I think anybody in the tech sector sort of has to recognize that the transfer of human beings from one thing to another takes place all the time. And just by the way, Wenqi, here in California, the state tends to look down on non-competition agreements. So the state of California itself recognizes that, young, capable, skilled engineers sort of need to move from one company to another and can't be.
Yeah, there's the non-compete agreement among the recruiters. Yes.
Yeah. So, then the flip side is, can you base a strategy completely on stealing and copying? And the answer is no. If I dial back to 2007, nobody could have foreseen the Apple iPhone. And what an amazing breakthrough. I remember when I heard that Apple was making a phone, and in those days, you could probably remember that Nokia had, basically.
Yeah, the flip phones. Yeah,
a really simple phone, and Motorola had a phone, and the Chinese were coming along, with things that looked like Nokias and Motorola's. And out of nowhere, Steve Jobs created this amazingly new device. And, even today, let's put aside government restrictions on buying iPhones. iPhone still has a decent market share inside of the Chinese market, even if you put aside, Xiaomi and Huawei and everybody else. So I think here in America, one of the things that comes out in my book, I talk about America being the alpha guys, where we are very good at fundamental breakthroughs of technology. We're not necessarily as good as the Chinese at rapidly commercializing it.
Yes.
And that's our own weakness, that we need to work on. But, look at Elon Musk. He was a guy who wasn't even a car guy, and out of nowhere, he created an electric vehicle business that became more valuable than every other car company in the world combined.
I think this is going to. Yeah, I do think this is going to be a major, difference, right, between the Chinese model and American model, sort of who owns the right to the original idea. And if you take the idea and then, maybe adaptive, turn it into something different, slightly different, even just slight, does that infringe on your intellectual property rights? And if you look at almost everything China is selling that, it's all slightly different from the original very big idea. And so it is something I think they're very used to, but I'm not sure if, again, right, the US or the West-led kind of, market practice would, truly embrace or accept that behavior. And so China, I would say, obviously after your departure in 2015, has undergone a very different period of growth and development. And you said China is likely to become the model of Singapore. And what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so let me elaborate a little bit on that. I mean, obviously, the comparison of China and Singapore of 1.4 billion people versus 6 million people is not a great one. But let's start by, if you look at the Chinese government, the central government, the challenge they have is that as the economy naturally slows down, we move from growth rates of 10% down to 4% or even 3%. There's going to be, some level of discontent, and there's going to be, feedback from the general Chinese population of what's the value add of the Chinese government. And we all know that the central government is an authoritarian government that often, applies the law arbitrarily.
Yes.
So that's called rule by law rather than rule of law.
Rule of law, yeah.
But what's kept the central government in power is performance legitimacy. So the amazing success over decades of pulling all these people out of poverty and making people wealthy in China has given the Chinese government overwhelming support. And the Chinese government even today has the overwhelming support of most of the Chinese population. If you look at the urban middle class, they have an outlook where they accept limitations on their freedom and privacy in exchange for a sense of security.
And stability.
Yeah, and stability. And what I mean by that is, Li Keqiang, the previous premier, had said at one time, that we have to remember that 600 million Chinese only make $140 a month. Yeah. And so if you're the urban middle class, you don't necessarily want multi-party democracy because that inevitably could lead to, wealth redistribution. And, it could lead to a really restricted outlook for people who live in the cities. So, they support the central government. But I think what we have to recognize now is that as the economy hits certain bumps in the road, and the property sector is probably the most prominent challenge right now for China, that as the urban middle class sees their property assets, the values go down. They see stock market,
their wealth shrinking, stock market. Yes.
Yeah. There's a loss of confidence. The performance legitimacy is no longer good if the economy is not performing. And so I think that, this then leads to a question of, does the Chinese population want better accountability? Do they want, a government that has greater transparency and fairness in the application of the law and, better, more efficient allocation of resources? And, those are all things that, if you look at Singapore, Singapore is a one-party state, but Singapore excels in things like, transparency, fairness, and efficiency in, the allocation of state resources. So that's really what I think the Chinese population over time, they'll demand accountability from the government. And, I think the challenge for the central government has got to be that, they're going to have to think about a shift in strategy away from so much support for the state sector and a suppression of, entrepreneurs and business leaders. And they're going to have to think about rebalancing to more private sector support and more domestic consumption. And, as we know, the biggest problem for the central government will be there are a lot of, vested interests in China in the current economy, with the current status quo. And so it'll be incredibly hard to further reform to rebalance the economy, given the resistance of, these vested interests.
Yeah, I think the Singapore example probably is best described as, Chinese people would like to be wealthier and wealthy, right? If you look at Singapore, the living standard is one of the top in the world.
Yeah.
and perhaps, in exchange for that, they are willing to have a government that is more involved in your daily life. And, so long as it's used in a way that is to guarantee security, stability, and, no chaos, basically.
Right.
And from
Wow.
that point of view, yes, I do think, from what a lot of what Singapore government and the regime in Beijing are doing together, they seem to see eye to eye when it comes to governance in that respect, and less sort of willing to, consider the Western or the pure US-led Western model. And so from your book, right, since you talk about the role of state, you also say the power of the state provides China's greatest potential and its gravest inherent risk for prosperity. We still have to discuss, how much the Communist Party should really control the government, society, as well as the economy. That's fundamentally the big question.
Yes.
And do you think China, to have a better future, will need the party's stronger control?
Good question. So, what I see today is the central government is making a major effort on industrial policy to, Xi Jinping talks about new productive forces, and, let's invest state resources and local government resources in new technologies and higher level manufacturing. And that's all good. But, the problem is that, as we know, when governments do things like that, there tends to be a lot of corruption. There tends to be, a lot of betting on the wrong companies and big distortions in the market. And, in America, we live in a world where there's checks and balances and, separation of powers, so that the federal government and the state governments are really, relatively speaking, not that powerful. And the risk for China is that if the central government suppresses the entrepreneurs and the business leaders, they're really putting a brake on economic growth. And I, based on my experience over decades in China, I feel that the central government of China should get out of the way of Chinese entrepreneurs. So I'm a believer, Wen-Chi, in that Air China should be private, China Mobile should be private, Bank of China should be private, and just let them rip. And that the central government should become a very powerful regulator, which is perfectly fine. But the problem here, Wen-Chi, is that the companies I just mentioned all have vested interests who will resist, the privatization of their businesses. Yeah.
Well, I think on that note, we can all see that Beijing is still trying to find the right balance, and probably the middle balance point is constantly moving depending on the current state of China as a country, as an economy and society. But there's never a dull moment when it comes to China. And so thank you for being on our show to share your, decades of experience doing business and living in China. Also a very interesting view that, you don't normally hear in the US or in the Western society. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Wen-Chi, for having me on your show.
Thank you.